Welcome back to Centered. I'm Zach Belo. I am the Director of Spiritual Formation for One Life Church, and we're excited to be in week 6. I can't believe it's already week 6 of Centered. Again, Centered is all about worldview, which our working definition of that is your answers to the most important and meaningful questions of life. And back in week 4, we asked the question, what's wrong with the world? And we sort of explored that through different worldviews. Well, today we're going to kind of extend that a little further and ask the question, what's the cure? And so today we're going to go through some of the worldview's answers to that question, what's the cure? And as always, we're going to work through, I'm sure you're getting tired of hearing about it by now, but just when you're tired of hearing about it, means it's probably sticking in your memory. And so every week we're going through the worldview grid. We're taking it so that we can compare sort of apples to apples, so we can ask the same questions of every worldview. We're going through the grid, and we'll put it back on the screen. The grid, the first step that we go through is the claims. What claims does each worldview make in answering the question? Then we move to reasons. Every worldview has reasons they make such a claim. And then the move that's often ignored is implications, because the claims that we make and the answers that we hold do have implications in all areas of our life. And so we approach implications by saying, if this is true, then this is true. And finally, what action should expire? We can't forget that our answers aren't just thoughts, they actually come out in actions. So as we approach the question, what's the cure, the first thing that came to my mind actually is this movie. I don't even know when maybe it was the 90s, maybe it was the 2000s, but it was My Big Fat Greek Wedding. I don't know if you saw that, but the dad in that movie, like the cure for everything for him was Windex. Like you had a burn, you spray Windex on it. You have, a pimple, you spray Windex on it, whatever it is. And so that got me thinking about my family's like cures for things. And at first I remembered a story of I was probably 10 years old, and I was outside playing at my grandma's house, and a wasp flew down my shirt and stung me like a bunch of times. And I ran in to tell my grandma, and all of a sudden she took out one of my family members, like a pack of cigarettes. She cut it open and started chewing the stuff inside the cigarettes. And that right there made everything stop hurting, because I was like, what are you doing? And she put the tobacco on my burn, or on my stings. And apparently that is some old school backwoods cure for bee stings. And I don't know if it worked or if I was just so weirded out by the fact that my grandma was chewing cigarettes, but it stopped hurting. And so that made me start wondering, does my family have any more of those things? And so this morning I texted my parents and asked them if we had any more cures, like backwoods crazy cures for things. And they sent me a few things that I just had to share. This is probably going to be a little too telling of how crazy my family is. But she said, my Aunt Nancy swore that if you sliced a potato and taped it onto your eye, it would remove a sty. This is a weird one. My Aunt Trish, the first day of May, every single May, first day, she would wake up, not talk to anyone, go outside and get the grass and wipe dew all over her face on the first day of May, because she swore that if you wipe dew on your face the first day of May, then it would cure freckles. So I guess you didn't know that probably. Back to Aunt Nancy. If you got a burn, she'd be there in just a second with a big old glob of butter, and she'd spread it all over your burn because she was sure that was the cure. And then finally my mom told me that every time she went, the thing she did not like about going to her great-grandma's house is that every time she went there, first thing, great-grandma made her drink a spoonful of castor oil to fight off worms. And so there you go. We got a weird family. But I would love to hear, it's kind of a fun thing. I have fun talking back and forth with my parents. If you send out a text to some of your family members, see if they remember any of your family members having some kind of old-timey folk cure for something. And it'd be a fun thing to go to our message board. Remember, you can get there by in our Facebook group, One Life Anywhere. and you can go to the Centered tab on that, and we would love to hear some of your other like old school cures for things. But when we look at the problems of our world, and like I said, in week 4, we saw that almost every worldview acknowledges some kind of problem, at least the majority of them. But we're left with the question, what, if anything, is the cure? And so today we're going to explore that, and we're going to start, like we always do, with a film that was produced and created by our creative arts team here. And so as we go through the film, like always, just in your participant guide, write down thoughts that come up, write down things that stick out to you, maybe questions that it raises in your mind, jot down something that moves you. We ask that you enjoy the film and write down anything that you think stands out.
Imagine you've done something genuinely awful. All your friends, family, and society agree it's awful. At first, you don't see it as awful because you had your reasons. You believe it was justified. But the more you think about it and listen to others, you finally come to the crushing reality that you are truly guilty. Guilty of something awful. Is there any way to get the stain of awfulness removed, or are you condemned to live the rest of your life as the one who did something awful? One approach would be to adopt a worldview that says, good and evil don't really exist. It's not hard to find philosophers who would agree with you. Taking that approach, you might be able to convince yourself you were in the clear, but it would be doubly hard to convince everyone else, especially those who suffered from your awful deed. While some worldviews hold that good and evil are simply social constructs, let's face it, the idea doesn't match our experience. From racism to rape to thievery and exploitation, jealousy, murder, human trafficking, deception, hypocrisy, and arrogance. It's not hard to come up with a list of awful things human beings commit. And all of them qualify as genuinely wrong in a very real way. When awful acts are committed, most of us can feel the sense of justice well up within us that says, someone should pay a price for that. Most of our stories, and especially TV shows and movies, run on this plotline. Good person is opposed by a bad person. The bad person is the one who does all kinds of awful things, usually with a really awful attitude. By the end, you want the bad person to pay a price for being bad. A good story ends when the good person triumphs over the bad person. We're very creative on how we deal out justice to our bad guys. And it's not just in our stories. We see it in real life. Although we debate what kinds of punishment should be handed out to criminals, we all agree that something should happen. It's hard to imagine a world where the attitude to truly awful actions was something like, well, as long as you say you're sorry, no harm, no foul. That doesn't feel like justice. It feels superficial and disrespectful. Let's go back to our question. Let's say I realize I've done something awful and I want to get rid of the guilt. How do I wipe away the stain? Each worldview has some answer to the question of human guilt in light of justice. Eastern religions of most varieties think in terms of karma. Karma is the notion that one's present fate, one's pleasure or pain, one's being a king or a slave or a gnat, is the result of past action, especially in a former existence. The way the stain of awfulness is taken away is to do better in the new life version of who you are. But it's important to note, this is an impersonal system. There is no personal God to offer forgiveness. All I have to go on is to assume I might be doing something that will help me in the future. If we view life as nothing more than material things like atoms and molecules, the problem becomes even more, problematic. On this view, ethical requirements are the product of evolutionary history over time formed by whole societies. Society defines what is right, condemns what is wrong, and therefore can give out or withhold forgiveness. That raises a few questions. 1. If our brain cells are the product of impersonal, natural forces, who or what gives society the right to define right and wrong? After all, societies are simply large collections of individuals. 2. Throughout history, whole societies have participated in awful things. Who defines good and evil for them? 3. What if society decided to not grant forgiveness? Does that mean I am irredeemable? Islam takes a more personal approach. One Muslim website put it like this: if one repents sincerely and follows it up with righteous deeds and believes, then God promises them heaven and tells them that they will never be wronged. God holds no grudges. There is always a chance. Islam is a religion of hope. Our Muslim neighbor is glad to do all he can in order to measure up on the last day. And he knows that Allah is good. But the one underlying problem is, he cannot erase the question mark that always hangs over him when it comes to his eternal destiny and final judgment. Did I measure up or not? How can I know? John the Baptist is attested by history and viewed by Islam as a prophet, and was respected in his day as a great man of God. When he saw Jesus of Nazareth publicly, he would announce, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." In the Jewish context of the first century, where life happened in the shadow of the great temple of Herod, where lambs were regularly offered as sacrifices for sin, it would have conjured up a vivid image in everyone's mind. It said simply, "I've done something awful. I deserve to pay for the awful thing I've done, but instead, someone will stand in my place. Justice will be done, but I will be set free." Enter the cross. On the surface, the concept seems primitive, but if we think about how life really goes, we will see that it's not such a primitive idea after all. How is justice honored and forgiveness offered at the same time? The cross answers the question. It says the awful thing was truly awful and should be punished. But it also says someone else willingly paid the price in your place. The early Christian writer Paul summed it up well in his letter to the church at Rome. God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us.
Well, we hope that you enjoyed that film from our Creative Arts team. And so now we're going to move kind of and frame that again into the grid, because every worldview has some answer to the question, what's the cure? And so, as always, right now we're going to sort of take it through the grid and compare apples to apples when it comes to the question, what's the cure? And so first, claims. And we're going to use a scenario. It's an imperfect analogy, but it's a good, fun thought exercise that can help us work through the claims of different worldviews when we get to the question, what's the cure? So here's a scenario. Imagine yourself doing this. Okay, so you're invited to like a super fancy art opening at an art gallery, and this is like so fancy you got to rent a tux and like an evening gown or a top hat, that kind of thing, maybe a monocle. But you're at the art gallery and you're walking around, and you drop your program. No big deal, right? But you bend over to pick up your program without realizing that as you bend over, you're bumping a column that is holding a $400,000 ceramic vase. And so you bump it, and then everything sort of starts to move into slow motion because you see it falling. And as it's falling, you try to catch it, but it slips through your fingers just at the last second, and it breaks into 1,000 pieces all over the floor. The whole crowd's staring at you, and you know that you don't have $400,000, and you want to run away, but there's security cameras. What do you do? So the question is, if we use the same scenario and we quantify it and make it an illustration for the brokenness of all humanity, thinking back to this example, the question is, what's the cure? What are some possible ways that we could fix the problem? And so we want to address different worldviews with that question, thinking of the broken vase as humanity's problems. What's the cure? And so thinking back to the film, how might an Eastern worldview address the problem of the bowl? Again, I think this is in your participant guide. You can just jot down your answers. But as the breaker of the bowl, what would your fate be, or how could you fix it in the Eastern worldview? Like, what are some of your thoughts? So when I was thinking through this question, I just went to the idea of kind of karma. And so there's more answers than this, obviously. But, the whole idea of karma, you broke the bowl. It's going to cost you kind of better luck in your next life thing. You got the good and the bad. That's kind of a strike against you. And so what about Islam? The video told us that in Islam, Allah is the ultimate judge, but the question is, how will he judge? You broke the ceramic bowl. What do you do to make up for it? And how do you know if you're forgiven? So just think through that in light of that. What are some of your options? So one possible answer, thinking through the Islamic worldview, is that you could try to glue the bowl back together again, which you can never do. You could try to pay the artist back, which most of us can never do. Or you could do a whole bunch of good deeds for the artist, but you would kind of go to your death never really knowing if you're forgiven or not. You would just be kind of crossing your fingers that you did enough to appease the artist. How about naturalism? We've talked a lot about naturalism or materialism, the idea that everything is broken down just to matter, chemicals, particles, that kind of thing. No supernatural. So the problem seems pretty easy for the naturalist, even though it doesn't really match reality. There is no artist, and there is no objective right or wrong really either. So you broke the lamp, you just say sorry and walk away. So what about the Christ-centered worldview? If we think of Jesus as the artist, how do we fix the problem of the broken ceramic bowl? This is one of the things that I find beautiful about the Christ-centered worldview. First, the Christ-centered worldview acknowledges the reality that we all sort of know as we approach this question, that no matter how hard we work to glue the pieces back together, even if we successfully glue all 1,000 pieces back together, it's not the same bowl that it was. It's broken, that we can never do that. And we acknowledge the reality that no matter how much we save, most of us could probably never pay that back. We can never fix it ourselves. But in a Christ-centered worldview, thankfully, we know the artist. And if we fall on the mercy of the artist forgives us and then fixes the bowl himself. And naturally, out of that, we become the artist's biggest fan. And so this has implications not only in this moment that we receive forgiveness, but on how we frame the rest of our lives. But we'll get into that later. But yeah, the implication is that the artist has forgiven us, and so now we're the artist's biggest fans. So moving to the second part of the grid. Again, this is centered. We're exploring the Christ-centered worldview. So we want to ask the question, what are some of the reasons and implications of the claims that Christians make? And so historically, the answer to the question, what's the cure, is in the Christ-centered worldview, is Jesus' death on the cross. But historically, theologians have used a number of different words and analogies and examples to sort of explain that. And it's all sort of housed in this theological language that's hard to understand. But it's these concepts like recapitulation, sacrifice, expiation, moral communication, satisfaction, ransom. And each of these words that aren't really necessary to know are just summary descriptions of what is found in Scripture when it's talked about Christ's sacrifice. And it's all just a little glimpse, a little picture of one thing that we can take away from what it meant. And I love how theologian Dr. Stephen Cohn says this. He says, "There is a depth of riches in Christ. Because Christ's saving work is the work of a divine person in history, because it deals with the absurdity of sin and because its purpose is to bring us into life whose fullness we cannot yet imagine, no human concept can completely sum up the way that Christ saves us. There are multiple analogies, each reflecting different insights and responding to different questions, none of which serve as the master narrative that the others must fit into. Through all of them, we seek to understand our reconciliation to God. And I love how he describes that, because he's saying we have all these concepts and we hear all these things about what Christ's sacrifice did for us on the cross, those big theological words, and when we ask ourselves, which one's right, which one is it? And what Dr. Cohn is saying is that they are all this mosaic, or this piece on this larger mosaic of what Christ's work is. They all work together to help us get us still incomplete, but the larger and larger understanding of what Christ's sacrifice on the cross means to us, means to humanity. And so he says there is no master narrative that all the other ones have to fit into. They all help us seek to understand our reconciliation to God. This idea, they all help us understand what we do with the broken bowl. And so now, you may notice when this is all done that this video this week is a little shorter than the others, and it's because this week you're going to be the researcher yourself. And so we're going to put up quite a few different verses, and if you're in a group, if you're in a small group, you can just break these off into smaller groups and have each group do a couple of these verses. But what we're trying to do is piece together this mosaic. We're trying to expand our understanding of the mystery that is Christ's sacrifice and the implications of what that has to do for people, for humanity. And so I'm going to put these up. We'll go through one together. But as we go through them, again, they'll be in your participant guide as well, so have that close by. But we're going to put up the questions that you're going to want to ask. So the first question is, what does this verse tell us about Christ, and what does it say about us? So what does it tell us about Christ? What does it tell us about us? Second one to explore would be, how and in what way does Christ save? The third one is, how do we move on from the stain of sin? How do we move on from guilt? How do we move on from shame? And then the fourth one is a very important question that we can't overlook, and it's the flaw in the broken bowl analogy. But how is justice honored and forgiveness offered at the same time? That was one of the things that the video pointed out, was that when there's this sense of wrongdoing, we all have this welled up sense of a need for justice. And so how does this verse that we're going through point to justice being honored and forgiveness being offered at the same time? So we're going to put these up on the screen, and if you have your participant guide, they're all there. If not, you can jot these down, and we'll give you a minute to do that, and then we'll do one together. So we'll put these up now for 30 seconds or so. Okay, the one that I want to look at, you'll see down the way a little bit, it's actually comparing two, because it's taken an Old Testament story, a strange little Old Testament story that seems like, why is that in here? And then we see Jesus actually talking about it. So we're going to look at Numbers 21, 4 through 8, and we're going to look at that alongside John 3, 14 through 17. So here's this little bizarre story from Numbers where in the Old Testament, Moses is leading the Israelites out of Egypt. He's trying to get them to the Promised Land. All kinds of things happen, and we read this story as a story along the way. They're trying to, they're learning how to worship and live with this God that they're just sort of meeting. And this is the story. Numbers 21. They traveled from Mount Or along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom. But the people grew impatient on the way. You see that a lot because they're wandering around the desert. They spoke against God and against Moses, saying, "Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There's no bread, there's no water, and we detest this miserable food." That kind of sounds like my children as I go on road trips with them. Verse 6, it says, "Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them. They bit the people, and many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, 'We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that God will take the snakes away from us.' So Moses prayed for the people. Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Make a snake and put it up on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live.' So Moses made a bronze snake and put it up on a pole. Then anyone who was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake lived." So there's a story in the Old Testament. It seems strange. We're reading that God is sending the snakes, and that's probably problematic for some people, whether God sent the snakes or the Israelites thought God sent the snakes. Either way, we see God saving them from these snakes by raising up on a pole this golden snake, and anyone who looked on it lived. And so now we fast forward thousands of years, and Jesus is talking to a Pharisee named Nicodemus, and as he's talking to Nicodemus, he says this. It's John 3:14 through 17. "Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that everyone who believes may have eternal life in him. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him." And so we put those two side by side, and we learn something about the sacrifice of Christ and what it means for humanity. In such a unique and neat way, Jesus brings back this story from obscurity of the Old Testament and brings it to him as a living example of the snake being lifted up, that whoever looks at him and believes will live. And so it's just, again, these two texts together. This doesn't tell us the whole story. No singular verse that you're going to pull up is going to tell the whole story of Christ's sacrifice. But it gives us a small piece of the larger mosaic of what it means, what Christ's sacrifice on the cross means for our initial forgiveness and then for life afterwards as well. And it makes sense in one sense, but it's also more mysterious than we ever know. So, yes, take some time. Maybe you want to move on with the lesson and then come back to this. But take some time this week or right now to pause and go through those verses and just look back at the questions that we had and just explore for yourself in your own mind, in your own heart. Start to build that larger mosaic of what Christ's sacrifice means. So moving on to the through the grid to implications. Again, we're thinking if, then, because ideas have consequences, right? Like our thoughts aren't simply these standalone things. They impact other areas of our life. And so what are some of the implications of Christ's saving work that you found in some of those verses? Maybe you have already jotted those down, but if not, you can look back through because we're not, like I said, we're not just trying to build up right ways to talk about it. We're looking at how it informs our lives. And so go back and think through and write down some of the implications of the verses we just examined. And then take some time to think of any more. Is there any more that you can think of? This idea of if, then. If God came to earth and died for us, then what does that mean for us? And then finally, through the grid, we look at the last thing, which is actions. Because our worldview, the way we answer these questions is lived out. And so if the Christ-centered worldview is correct and the incarnation and death on the cross are a cure for the brokenness of humanity, what actions should expire? How should we live out of that? How should this change the way we think and act in the world? Or again, to go back, how do we respond to the fact that the artist, or how do we respond to the artist who forgave us for breaking the $400,000 ceramic bowl? And again, this points to to me, the most beautiful parts of the Christ-centered worldview. Because when you compare righteous acts or deeds or good works between worldviews, there's a distinct difference. If we go back to Islam and you think through the quote that you heard on the screen, that you saw on the screen and heard in the video, it's talking about Allah is the ultimate judge, and it's saying that if you perform enough righteous deeds, then you'll be forgiven. But the problem is we never know. You work and you work and you work. You're trying to do these to earn something that you never know if you'll get. And that's daunting, that's heavy, along with a number of things. But when you look at the Christ-centered worldview, again, thinking even of the ceramic bowl, any righteous deeds that you do is not to earn anything. Forgiveness was granted. So that is off the table. You are walking under the umbrella of grace. Any righteous deed you do is a response. It's not to earn anything. It's just coming naturally out of a life of a person that no longer lives under the fear of shame and the fear of guilt and the need to earn their salvation, a need to earn their love and forgiveness. That was given. And so there's just this beautiful difference in the way the Christ-centered worldview approaches this and the hope it means for the rest of our life, because within the Christ-centered worldview, once you accept that forgiveness, once you accept the forgiveness of the artist, the rest of your life you walk under the freedom and umbrella of grace, living just in a freedom from shame and guilt and all of that. That's the good news. Not only that we're forgiven, but that we are given the freedom to live fully. And we're going to get to explore that more next week. I can't believe it's our last week. But yes, week 7 is coming up, and the question that we will explore is there hope? And so we'll hear more about this next week. One final thing for this week. We've been doing the practice each week, and I hope you've had a chance to do that. But this week, as we prepare, this is again in preparation for next week when we talk about is there hope. Here's the practice. We'll throw it up on the screen. It says this week, spend some time prayerfully reading through John's account of Jesus' death on the cross. That's John chapter 18 and 19. As you read, put yourself in the room, put yourself in the crowd, place yourself at the scene of the cross. And then prayerfully reading simply means directing the words you're reading and your inner monologue as you read back towards God. So this can include, your doubts, your joy, your sadness. As you read, you're just offering it all to God. And so this week, take some time to do that, and we'll see you back for our final week, week 7, next week. Thanks.